They were supposed to die with dignity. That's the unspoken promise of royalty. From the moment they're wrapped in silk swaddling and declared heirs to empires, kings, queens, and emperors are expected to be different. Above it all, they're painted into the mythos of civilization as gods in human clothes, too divine to bleed, too sacred to bloat, too exalted to choke on their own gluttony or die screaming in a privy. And yet, history disagrees, violently, because the truth, whispered in court corridors and footnoted by bored chroniclers, is that royal deaths are often just as embarrassing, absurd, and weirdly gastrointestinal as everyone else's. If anything, they're worse. And that's not because of bad luck. It's because royalty, in their relentless pursuit of immortality, ceremony, and ever larger helpings of roasted swan, stuffed with dates and regret, somehow managed to court the most ironic ends imaginable. This series is about that, about the mismatch between the pedestal and the pit, about monarchs who ruled continents but couldn't survive desert, about emperors who built roads across mountains but forgot not to drink mercury, about leaders who died doing the very things they warned their subjects not to do, like making deals with alchemists, trusting 15th century canons, or eating 14 servings of cream pastry on an empty stomach. It's not just about death, it's about the collapse of illusion. Royal deaths, especially the bad ones, peel back the velvet and gold and reveal something gloriously average beneath. Something human, fragile, sometimes ridiculous, often bloated, and occasionally on fire. Before we dive into specifics, and we will dive, let's pause for a moment and consider what death was supposed to look like for a royal. The idealized version. It usually involved some combination of last words in Latin, a slow fade, surrounded by sobbing courtiers, maybe a strategically timed sunset outside the window. There would be incense, priests, perhaps even a harp in the background. The monarch would grasp the hand of their successor, whisper wisdom, forgive enemies, and expire gracefully like a candle going out at the end of a very expensive dinner. That's the version sung in ballads. Now here's what actually happened. A man in Sweden ate so much dessert that his stomach collapsed. A pope died in bed with another man's wife. A Scottish king stood too close to his cannon and was instantly converted into a cloud of limbs. A Viking warlord tied a severed head to his saddle and died because the teeth of the head scratched his leg and gave him an infection. A Chinese emperor spent decades seeking eternal life, only to be poisoned by his own immortality pills, and then quietly transported across the countryside with a wagon of rotting fish to mask the smell of his corpse. You can't make this up. And no, these aren't fringe rulers from insignificant states. These are emperors who built walls, kings who changed laws, leaders whose decisions shaped entire centuries. But history, cold and unfeeling as it is, often remembers their exits better than their edicts. There's something deeply unsettling and oddly satisfying about that, because royal deaths have a way of puncturing the grand narrative. They remind us that no matter how much power you have, no matter how many titles precede your name, your final moment might involve a misjudged fart, a stray monkey, or a slightly too enthusiastic court jester. The throne offers no immunity from absurdity, and the crown doesn't come with a guarantee of dignity. In fact, it might attract the opposite. That's the core irony. The more ceremonial your life is, the more comically tragic your death might be. The weight of expectation crushes even the most majestic of exits, and the gap between the myth and the mess becomes a chasm. We remember Alexander the Great for weeping when there were no more worlds to conquer, but we also remember King George II for dying on the toilet. We honor Catherine the Great for modernizing Russia. And then there's the horse rumor. It's not fair, it's not accurate, but it is inevitable. Royalty doesn't get the benefit of anonymity. Their deaths are scrutinized, whispered about, recorded, embellished, and then retold across generations with increasing layers of scandal. Sometimes they asked for it. Many monarchs were obsessed with legacy, often to a delusional degree. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, was so afraid of dying that he funded entire expeditions in search of magical herbs, built an underground army of terracotta warriors, and consumed mercury like it was vitamin C. He wanted to live forever. He barely made it out of middle age. And then there are those who ignored every warning, like Henry I of England, who was told repeatedly to stop eating lampreys, a fish that looks like something invented by nightmares, but insisted on gorging himself until his intestines launched a full rebellion. His last words may have been delicious, but they weren't wise. Or Charles II of Navarre, also known as Charles the Bad, not a nickname you get for kindness, who was so sick that his doctors wrapped him in brandy, soaked linen, and then accidentally set him on fire. He didn't go out like a king. He went out like a Molotov cocktail in royal slippers. Each of these deaths tells us something, not just about the individual, but about the world they ruled, because the absurdity of royal death often mirrors the absurdity of royal life. Monarchs lived surrounded by rituals that made little sense, informed by advisors who often lied, and treated by doctors who thought demons lived in your spleen. Combine that with inherited power, limitless food, and zero accountability, and you've got a recipe for disaster. A very elaborate, gold-plated, musically accompanied disaster. It's also important to note how these deaths were recorded, or not recorded. The official accounts often try to soften the blow. They say things like, died suddenly, or passed peacefully in sleep, when in fact the person fell off a balcony while trying to seduce a neighbor or was fatally kicked by livestock. The euphemisms are part of the performance. History tries to maintain the illusion, but sometimes a rogue scribe or a disillusioned court servant slips in the truth. And those are the moments that survive, because no one forgets the king who was killed by a monkey, or the emperor who drowned in a bathtub under suspicious circumstances, or the poet queen who defeated an invading army and then quietly went back to writing hymns. We remember the failures, the humiliations, the grotesque ironies, because they make the past feel less like a marble statue and more like a bloated corpse in a velvet robe. This is not about laughing at death. Not really. It's about laughing at the systems that pretend death is neat, noble, or earned. It's about challenging the myth that power protects. It doesn't. It never did. And in the end, the only real difference between a peasant and a king is that the king's worst moment is recorded in 3 languages and performed as street theatre for the next 100 years. So welcome to the worst moments in royal history. Prepare yourself for indigestion, combustion, scandal, teeth, and toilets. It won't be pretty, but it will be honest. And in that honesty, there's a strange kind of dignity, not in how they died, but in how we refuse to forget it. Not because we're cruel, but because we're curious. Because somewhere deep down, we like knowing that the people who wore crowns also made terrible decisions, trusted bad advice, and died in ways that would make a peasant laugh into his soup. Royal death. Undignified, unforgettable, utterly human. King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden was not a particularly interesting monarch. He didn't start any major wars. He didn't reform the economy. He didn't assassinate rivals or construct massive palaces. In fact, if he had died in any other way, it's possible that no one outside Sweden would remember him at all. But instead of dying with dignity, he died with whipped cream on his face. And so, history has chosen to remember him, not as a legislator, not as a reformer, but as the king who ate himself to death. His reign, which lasted from 1751 to 1771, was characterized by political impotence and a growing dependence on the Swedish parliament. He was, in many ways, a constitutional monarch before that title had much glamour. His job was mostly to sign documents, pose for portraits, and not get in the way, which he did with remarkable consistency. But while Adolf Fredrik was weak in politics, he was strong in appetite. And on one cold February evening in 1771, that appetite became a fatal flaw. It began, as these things often do, with a meal. But not just any meal. A royal feast of indulgence so excessive it bordered on performance art. First, lobster, then caviar, then sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. Not one flute, multiple. Possibly enough to induce dizziness in the most stable of courtiers. Already, this would have been enough to cripple a lesser man. But Adolf Fredrik wasn't done. He was saving himself for dessert. That dessert was semla, a Scandinavian sweet roll made of wheat flour and cardamom, filled with almond paste, topped with whipped cream, and served floating in a bowl of warm milk. It's the kind of dessert you eat slowly, with reverence, and then regret. Most people stop at 1, some at 2. Adolf Fredrik stopped at 14. 14 semlas. That's not indulgence. That's a sugar-based suicide note. It's unclear exactly what compelled him to eat that many. Boredom? Ego? A deep, existential craving for cream? What we do know is that at some point between semla number 10 and semla number 14, the servants likely began to panic. Someone probably suggested a digestive walk. Someone else may have gently whispered about moderation, but the king waved them off, spoon in hand, cream on lip, crown slightly askew. He kept going. And then, later that evening, he collapsed. The official cause of death was digestive problems. That's the diplomatic version. The truth is less polite. His stomach revolted. His body shut down. And the King of Sweden died, not from poison, not from war, not from age or treachery, but from pastry. Some historians have tried to argue that the semla wasn't solely to blame, that his death was the result of cumulative gastrointestinal distress, exacerbated by decades of rich living. But that's exactly the point. This wasn't a sudden act of culinary misfortune. It was a royal lifestyle distilled into a single, tragic, cream-filled evening. Adolf Fredrik had everything a monarch could want. Wealth, palaces, servants, portraits of himself on furniture. But what he didn't have was restraint, and it killed him. What's remarkable is how peacefully he died, at least compared to other monarchs. He wasn't assassinated. He didn't fall off a horse. He didn't succumb to plague or get poisoned by a rival. He died full, overly full, disastrously full. And that, in some strange way, has given him a kind of posthumous dignity, because in the long gallery of royal deaths, swords, toilets, fires, and betrayal, his stands out for its softness, its absurdity, its quiet, bloated finality. The man died eating dessert, and that, for better or worse, has made him immortal. Sweden remembers Adolf Fredrik with a strange mixture of affection and embarrassment. He's sometimes referred to as the king who ate himself to death, which is both true and deeply reductive. He did introduce some mild administrative reforms. He was interested in science. He owned a telescope, but none of that matters because of semla. History, as always, plays favourites, and it loves a dramatic ending, which is why Adolf Fredrik has been immortalized in schoolbooks, trivia games, and low-budget historical reenactments, not for his policies, but for his pastry. There is a lesson here, though it may be hard to digest. Power does not protect you from consequence, not even the consequence of dessert. And indulgence, when taken far enough, stops being celebration and starts becoming self-destruction. Adolf Fredrik didn't die because he was evil, or foolish, or unlucky. He died because he didn't stop. And that is the quiet tragedy at the heart of his ridiculous end. It's easy to laugh at him, to shake our heads at the excess. But somewhere, in that royal dining room, between the laughter and the whipped cream, there's also a warning. One that's been whispered through history, ignored by monarchs and mortals alike. Stop at 1, or 2, at most, because you never know when the next bite might be your last. So the next time you reach for another helping of cake, or tell yourself that one more scoop won't hurt, think of King Adolf Fredrik. Think of the 14 semlas. Think of the crown that slipped sideways as the spoon went in. And then, maybe, just maybe, put the fork down. Or don't. It's your stomach. Just don't expect history to be kind. Because while it may forget your victories, it will never, ever forget your dessert. There are many ways for a monarch to die: assassination, illness, poison in a jeweled goblet, a fatal tumble off a ceremonial horse. But King George II of Great Britain, with all the options afforded to him by power, privilege, and empire, chose the toilet, or rather, the toilet chose him. It was the morning of the 25th of October, 1760, and George, by then 76 years old and visibly fraying at the edges, had risen for what was supposed to be an ordinary day. Ordinary, in royal terms, meant ceremonial conversation, perhaps a little grumbling about Parliament, and a private moment with the royal chamber pot. The king was in reasonably good spirits. He wasn't fighting off a war or a rebellion. He wasn't gasping for breath in a dramatic deathbed tableau. He simply needed to relieve himself. This would prove fatal. According to eyewitnesses and physicians, always two different species in royal households, George retired to his private bathroom and did not return. Servants, trained in the fine art of hovering discreetly, eventually realized something was wrong. When they entered, they found the monarch collapsed, mid-privy, trousers at half-mast, life extinguished, not by sword or treason, but by a sudden rupture of the aorta. An aneurysm, they said. A natural cause, a very human exit, but also, undeniably, a deeply undignified one. The juxtaposition was jarring. This was George II, King of Great Britain and Ireland, Elector of Hanover, Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a man who had outlived wars, navigated Jacobite uprisings, and endured the slow erosion of monarchical power in the face of parliamentary expansion. And yet, in the end, none of that mattered, because he died on the toilet. No final speech, no torch passed to the next generation, just a silent collapse amid porcelain and privacy. It is worth mentioning that the royal chamber pot was not, strictly speaking, a peasant's bucket. This was the 18th century, after all, and the British crown did not do austerity. The commode in question was likely gilded, flanked by attendants who were paid to pretend they saw nothing, and accompanied by the usual trappings of monarchical hygiene: perfumed cloths, lace-trimmed robes, and maybe even a fresco of Neptune on the ceiling to inspire regal reflection. But none of that could shield the king from the mortal truth of anatomy. An artery ruptured, blood surged, the monarch slumped forward, and that was that. Medical accounts confirm the nature of the aneurysm. Sudden, irreversible, painless, if you believe in small mercies. And yet, despite the clinical neatness of the event, the symbolic impact was catastrophic. Because while it's one thing for a king to die, it's quite another for him to do so in the act of answering nature's call. Royalty was supposed to be elevated, transcendent. The divine right of kings did not, as it turned out, extend to digestive privilege. George's death was, understandably, cleaned up for public consumption. The official announcements described it as sudden, sorrowful, and medically unfortunate. There were no public mentions of commodes or awkward body positioning. The palace released no sketches. The royal portraiture remained tasteful. But gossip did what gossip always does. It leaked. And somewhere between the footnotes and the whispered jokes of rival courts, the full picture emerged. George II died on the toilet. And history, with its sharp memory for irony, never let go. It did not help that George was the last British monarch to be buried in Westminster Abbey. His successors chose Windsor, or that his reign, while steady, was largely overshadowed by his more dynamic predecessor and his more ambitious grandson, or that he spent much of his final years arguing with ministers and slowly fading into irrelevance. His legacy, already teetering on the edge of forgettable, was sealed by the bathroom. And so, in the annals of monarchical misfortune, George II holds a rare distinction. He is remembered more for the position of his corpse than the content of his reign, more for the silence of his final moment than the speeches he delivered in life. It's a kind of historical economy. Death simplifies, and sometimes it simplifies brutally. We reduce kings to caricatures: the glutton, the madman, the conqueror, the corpse on the commode. There's something deeply democratic about that. Because for all the pomp and powdered wigs, for all the processions and portraits, death doesn't care about titles. It comes when it comes, and sometimes it comes when your pants are around your ankles. There are, of course, more noble interpretations. Some scholars argue that George's death was a fitting metaphor for the age, a monarch brought low not by rebellion or foreign invasion, but by his own fragile body, a quiet end to an era in which kings no longer commanded armies personally or ruled by divine edict. They governed through paperwork, bickering, and the slow erosion of ceremonial importance. In that context, the toilet was not humiliation.it was realism. But this is a generous reading, and history is not always generous. The more immediate truth is that George II's death, like so many others in the royal register, punctured the illusion of grandeur. It reminded his subjects, and now us, that the human machine is indifferent to rank, that the aorta does not check bloodlines before it bursts, and that even kings die awkwardly. Perhaps the most enduring image of George II is not the battlefield, or the throne room, or the stately silhouette on a coin. It's the quiet moment, alone in a chamber no painter would dare depict, where power gave way to physiology. There is no marble statue for that, but there is memory, lingering, inevitable, and ever so slightly amused. So the next time you hear the phrase royal flush, remember that it isn't always about playing cards. Sometimes it's about mortality, compressed into a single, tragic, porcelain moment. King George II ruled an empire, but he died like a man. There are many ways for a Viking to die. Sword through the ribs, arrow to the back, drowning in the cold waters off a raided monastery, maybe even falling from a longship while drunk on mead. These were considered acceptable, even honourable, ways to exit the world. But Sigurd the Mighty, Earl of Orkney, chose something different. He died because a dead man bit him. If that sentence sounds ridiculous, it's because it is. And yet, it's one of the earliest recorded examples of poetic justice, so absurd that even saga writers struggled to keep a straight face. Sigurd, sometimes referred to in records as Sigurd Eysteinsson, lived in the 9th century and was, by all surviving accounts, your standard issue, Viking warlord, big beard, bigger ego, a tendency to settle diplomatic disagreements with axes. He ruled over the Orkney Islands and parts of northern Scotland, which is already a bleak and wind-battered corner of the map even without the added bonus of Norse occupation. Sigurd spent his time doing what Norse earls did best, raiding, feuding, and generally asserting dominance over any territory within rowing distance. And for a while, it worked. He expanded his influence, defeated rivals, and built a fearsome reputation. Then he picked a fight with a local Scottish chieftain named Mael Brigte. Brigte, by contrast, did not have a terrifying nickname. He was just Brigte, a local power with a mustache and a bit of pride. According to the legend, they agreed to meet for battle with equal numbers, 40 men each, honourably matched, which, in Viking terms, means a temporary and tactical lie. Sigurd showed up with 80, because of course he did. This was not a man particularly concerned with fairness. The battle was brief, the betrayal effective. Brigte and his men were slaughtered, and Sigurd, ever the humble victor, had Brigte's severed head strapped to his saddle as a trophy. This was not unusual. Viking warriors often collected such tokens to display power, frighten enemies, and generally decorate their horses with aggressive accessories. The problem, and this is where anatomy and hubris intersect, is that Brigte's head still had teeth. As Sigurd rode triumphantly across the rugged terrain of Caithness, the head bounced against his leg, and one of Brigte's molars, likely still grimacing in defiance, scraped the Earl's shin, a minor cut, barely worth noticing. Except this was the 9th century, and medical hygiene was somewhere between non-existent and actively harmful. Germ theory had not yet been invented. Infection control consisted of maybe waving some smoke over the wound and praying to whichever god wasn't busy. Predictably, the wound festered, sepsis set in, and Sigurd the Mighty, victor of the battle, conqueror of the north, died not from an army, not from an assassin, but from a corpse's dental work. The irony is so dense you could forge armor from it. There is something grimly satisfying about the idea that Brigta, in death, still managed to take his enemy with him. It's the kind of historical anecdote that belongs more in a drunken toast than a textbook. And yet, there it is, preserved in the annals of the Orkneyinga saga, the semi-mythical, semi-accurate record of Norse exploits in the British Isles. It's unclear how much of the story is true. Medieval chroniclers were not known for their strict adherence to verifiable facts. They preferred a good moral over a solid source. But even if the detail about the tooth is metaphorical, an emblem of overconfidence biting back, the story has persisted for over 1,000 years. And in that persistence lies a strange kind of historical truth. Sigurd represents the classic Norse archetype of strength, undone by arrogance. He won the battle. He lost the war against bacteria. It is, in essence, the Viking version of slipping on a banana peel, the mightiest fall. And sometimes, they fall because they underestimated oral hygiene. What makes this story endure isn't just its absurdity, though that certainly helps. It's the image. A warrior lord, blood still drying on his blade, trotting through the highlands with a severed head thumping rhythmically against his thigh, the wind howling, the ravens circling, and somewhere, deep in the decaying gums of his enemy, a single tooth waiting patiently for revenge. It's the kind of tale that makes you pause. Not out of reverence, but out of the uneasy realization that for all our armor and ambition, we're still vulnerable to the stupidest things. A splinter, a sneeze, a dead man's molar. Sigurd's legacy, such as it is, has been reduced to this final punchline. He may have governed lands, led armies, and drank from skulls, but history remembers him as the man who got fatally nibbled by his own trophy. His epitaph, if we could find it, might as well read, "Here lies Sigurd the Mighty, conqueror, warrior, bitten. There is no statue, no grand monument, just a story passed down through time with equal parts laughter and disbelief." And perhaps that's fitting, because while empires fade and names are forgotten, the best kind of immortality is the kind that comes with a smirk. Sigurd got that, not the immortality he wanted, but the kind he deserved. So the next time you feel invincible, remember the Viking who wasn't killed by swords or storms, but by stubborn pride and an undead incisor. And maybe, just maybe, be careful where you tie your trophies. Because the dead, it turns out, bite back. There are many ways to eliminate a royal embarrassment. You can exile them, poison them, accuse them of treason, or if you're feeling particularly dramatic, execute them in front of a horrified court. But in 18th century Korea, one monarch decided to use furniture, and that is how Crown Prince Sado, heir to the Joseon throne, ended his life inside a wooden rice chest. It sounds like satire, something from a grim parody of palace intrigue, but it wasn't. It was real, and it remains one of the most infamous deaths in Korean history. Crown Prince Sado, born Yiseon in 1735, had all the markings of a tragic figure even before he was stuffed into a box. He was the son of King Yongjo, a ruler known for Confucian piety, a deep concern with appearances, and a level of moral rigidity that would make a stone blush. From a young age, Sado was told to be perfect. The problem was, he wasn't, depending on which records you believe, and most of them were edited by the people who survived him. Sado suffered from severe mental illness. He was prone to mood swings, violent outbursts, hallucinations, and prolonged periods of depression. In a modern context, he might have been diagnosed and treated. In an 18th century Confucian palace, he was simply labelled dangerous. Reports from the time describe him wandering the royal grounds at night with a sword, muttering to himself. He allegedly killed palace servants on impulse. He was feared by the court and deeply mistrusted by his own family. His father, King Yongjo, was particularly disturbed, but also bound by protocol. In Joseon, Korea, killing your own child, especially the crown prince, was both politically disastrous and morally unthinkable. Filial piety flowed both ways. A king was not only a ruler but a father, and to spill royal blood, even for reasons of state, was to risk spiritual contamination. So King Yongjo found a workaround. He summoned his son and had him step into a large wooden rice chest, the kind used to store grain. It was July, the height of Korean summer. The air was thick, the palace sweltering. The box was sealed. No air holes, no water, no mercy. Sado was left there to die. It took 8 days. 8 days inside a wooden container baking in the heat, surrounded by silence, shame, and the knowledge that the man who put you there was your own father. It's one of the slowest and most psychologically unsettling royal executions in recorded history. And yet, it was legal. Technically, King Yongjo never issued a direct death sentence. He simply ordered that the prince not be released. History, ever the careful record keeper of denial, noted the cause of death as divine judgment, which is a Confucian euphemism for "we needed him gone," and this was less messy than beheading. The royal court kept things quiet. There were no public announcements, no statues, no mourning processions. Prince Sado was erased as efficiently as possible, which is to say, not very efficiently at all, because while Sado died in silence, his story did not. His wife, Lady Hyegyong, lived on and wrote a memoir, one of the most chilling and detailed accounts of palace life ever composed. In it, she describes the emotional disintegration of her husband, the horror of his actions, the political games of the court, and the slow grinding machinery of a dynasty that valued face over family. It is not a defense. It is not an attack. It is simply a record, and it is devastating. Crown Prince Sado has since become a kind of historical Rorschach test. To some, he is a madman who threatened the stability of the nation. To others, he is a victim of court politics, crushed between expectations and untreated illness. He might be both, but regardless of interpretation, the method of his death remains a symbol of just how far power will go to avoid scandal. You can see the logic. A blade would have raised questions. A trial would have divided factions. But a box? A box solves everything. It's contained, quiet, plausibly deniable, and, above all, symbolic. Because what is a rice chest, if not a coffin you fill yourself? Sado's death was, in many ways, the perfect Confucian crime. It punished disobedience without technically shedding blood. It preserved the sanctity of the royal line, while eliminating the person who threatened it. It was horrifying, efficient, and deeply on brand for a dynasty that believed hierarchy was sacred and emotion was a threat. Ironically, the real legacy of Sado came not from him, but from his son, because the boy he left behind, Yi-san, would grow up to become King Jeongjo, one of the most respected and enlightened rulers in Korean history. Jeongjo modernized the bureaucracy, promoted scholarship, and quietly rehabilitated his father's memory without ever directly challenging the official narrative. He was a master of soft defiance. And perhaps that's the most tragic twist. The man who died in a box sired one of the greatest minds of the dynasty. There's no happy ending, just a bitter sense that something precious was buried alive, both literally and politically. Today, Sado's story is taught in textbooks, debated in classrooms, and dramatized in films. The box has become a metaphor, one that stretches far beyond the walls of Changdeok Palace. It represents repression, shame, the cost of appearances, and the ease with which a society can seal away what it doesn't want to confront. If you listen closely, the rice chest is still echoing, not with sound, but with warning, because the real horror of Sado's death isn't that he was locked in a box. It's that so many people stood outside and watched it happen. So the next time you hear a story about palace life, about dignity and tradition, and the wisdom of kings, remember that one of them murdered his son with lumber and sunlight, not out of hatred, but out of fear. And if that isn't history at its most suffocating, nothing is. King Martin of Aragon had many titles. King of Aragon, Valencia, Sardinia, Corsica, and a few more territories that mostly existed on maps and in diplomatic arguments. But the one title history gave him, the one he never wanted, was king who laughed himself to death. It sounds charming, quaint, even. The kind of death you might expect in a folk tale, somewhere between died of love and vanished into the mist. But the real story is far less poetic. It's the tale of a monarch who, already weakened by illness, asked for a distraction and got one so effective it finished him off. The year was 1410. Martin was 63, old by medieval standards, and not particularly healthy even by royal ones. His final days were plagued with digestive issues, a detail medieval chroniclers mentioned with such frequency, you start to wonder if the Iberian Peninsula ran on bowel reports. He had been suffering from indigestion, or what the court called a great swelling of the stomach. It may have been food poisoning, it may have been liver failure, or, more likely, it may have been the cumulative effect of decades of royal feasting and a complete lack of medical knowledge. Whatever it was, Martin was miserable. So, like many before him and many since, he asked to be entertained. Specifically, he summoned his court jester. Now, this jester was not known for subtle wit or philosophical insights. His act was famously ridiculous, somewhere between slapstick and surrealism, and on this particular day, he had a new joke, a joke that, by every account, was deeply stupid. The jester told the king that he had seen a young deer hanging from a fig tree, as if it had been punished for stealing figs. That was the punchline. A deer, a fig tree, stealing figs, hanged for its crime. That's it. That was the joke. And King Martin laughed. He laughed hard. So hard, in fact, that he couldn't stop. And somewhere between the wheezing, the clutching of the stomach, and the escalating hilarity of imagining a fig-thieving deer sentenced to death by tree, something gave out. Possibly his diaphragm, possibly his heart, possibly everything at once. Martin collapsed. Moments later, he was dead. The jester, we can assume, stood awkwardly by, wondering whether to take credit or flee the country. The court, meanwhile, scrambled to process what had just happened. There was no war, no poison, no treasonous stab in the back, just indigestion and an ill-timed punchline. The official cause of death remains disputed. Some say heart failure, others say acute indigestion. One account even claims a combination of terminal laughter and abdominal distress. But the legend has already decided. He died laughing, not figuratively, literally. The irony is suffocating. Martin had ruled during a period of political consolidation, religious upheaval, and diplomatic entanglements that spanned multiple kingdoms. He had brokered alliances, crushed rebellions, and managed the wildly complex politics of Iberian succession, and yet none of that made it into the popular memory. All anyone remembers is the deer, and the figs, and the laugh that killed a king. His death also created a minor constitutional crisis. Martin died without a direct heir, and his passing triggered the Compromise of Caspi, a major political negotiation that reshaped the crown of Aragon. So yes, the joke not only killed a monarch.it, also nearly fractured a kingdom. That's the kind of comedic timing that borders on strategic sabotage. The story has been retold over centuries, often with a smirk. The king who died of laughter. What a way to go. But beneath the absurdity is a quieter, colder reality. Laughter, in excess, is violent. It hijacks the body, overrides breath, disrupts rhythm. In a man already weakened, it became lethal. In that sense, King Martin's death wasn't whimsical. It was a medical accident disguised as a punchline. It also says something about how monarchs died, not on the battlefield, not in moments of glory, but in deeply human moments of vulnerability. Martin didn't die as a king. He died as a man who, for one brief second, forgot his pain, who found something genuinely funny in a life of duty and dysentery, and paid for it with his life. There's no monument to the joke, no bust of the deer, or statue of the fig tree, but there is a legacy, a reminder that even in the highest halls of power, absurdity waits, quietly, patiently, and sometimes it delivers the final blow. Today, King Martin's name appears in trivia books, in lists of bizarre deaths, in niche documentaries voiced in overly dramatic tones. He has been flattened into a historical punchline, but maybe there's some justice in that. He died laughing, and if you have to be remembered for one thing, it might as well be that you found something so ridiculous it made you forget the rest of your life, even if only for a moment. So the next time someone tells a bad joke and you feel that helpless, breathless, stomach-aching laughter start to rise, remember King Martin, and maybe don't lean too far into it. History is always listening, and it never forgets a punchline. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, was a man with a list. Conquer the warring states? Check. Standardize the currency, script, and axle widths? Check. Build massive roads, launch mega construction projects, and force thousands to build the Great Wall? Check. But somewhere near the bottom of that list, tucked between terrify future historians and commission the most unnerving clay army in world history, there was one final item: achieve immortality. This was not a metaphor. He did not want a legacy. He wanted to live forever. Literally, physically, indefinitely. In this, he was not alone. Our rulers throughout history have had a complicated relationship with mortality, but Qin Shi Huang had resources, power, and a total disinterest in moderation. And so, when he sent his alchemists and court doctors in search of the elixir of life, they did what most underpaid researchers in ancient regimes did. They made something up. That something was mercury. Yes, mercury. Liquid metal. Poison. The kind of substance you don't touch, let alone drink. But ancient Chinese alchemy, much like medieval European medicine, operated on a combination of hope, vague intuition, and blind guesses. Mercury was shiny. Mercury didn't decay. Mercury looked immortal. Therefore, someone reasoned, it must make you immortal. This is the logic that doomed a dynasty. Qin Shi Huang began ingesting mercury-based elixirs, believing they would preserve his body and extend his life. At first, they may have seemed to work. He was energetic. He was ambitious. He was absolutely convinced that death was for other people. And so, he drank more. But over time, his body betrayed him. Modern scholars now suspect that the symptoms he exhibited in the final years of his reign, paranoia, erratic behavior, intense secrecy, sudden outbursts, and declining health, were not signs of spiritual awakening. They were signs of mercury poisoning. The very substance he believed would grant him eternal life was, cell by cell, killing him. Slowly, painfully, ironically, he began to fear death even more. He launched expeditions to find the mythical Penglai Island, believed to house immortals. He consulted magicians, swallowed pills, funded rituals, and demanded that no one speak of death in his presence. Meanwhile, his body, riddled with toxins, began its irreversible decline. In 210 BCE, while on a tour of eastern China, still hoping for that one last alchemical breakthrough, he collapsed and died. Not in a grand palace, not in a mountain temple, but somewhere on the road, possibly in a carriage, surrounded by scrolls, attendants, and a large amount of false hope. His death presented a unique problem. Because he had made such a spectacle of not dying, no one had a plan for what to do when he inevitably did. His ministers, terrified of the consequences, decided to keep it a secret. They placed his body in a carriage filled with fish to mask the smell and continued the journey as if nothing had happened. Historians note, with grim amusement, that his post-mortem road trip was longer than some people's reigns. Eventually, his body was brought back to the capital and interred in one of the most ambitious tomb complexes ever built. The mausoleum of the first Qin emperor remains one of the largest funerary projects in the world, guarded by the now famous Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-sized warriors, horses, and chariots crafted to accompany him into eternity. But while the tomb was designed to reflect his godlike aspirations, it also reflected his paranoia. According to records, the burial chamber contained rivers of mercury, designed to simulate flowing water in the afterlife. Mercury again. Even in death, he could not let it go. He drowned in delusion. Quite literally, Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality achieved the opposite. Instead of eternal life, he earned eternal irony. Instead of being remembered as a deathless god king, he is remembered as a man who poisoned himself with his own medicine. It is a story so drenched in metaphor that you'd assume it was fiction, but the historical evidence is depressingly real. The emperor who unified China under one rule, who created a centralized bureaucracy, a massive infrastructure, and a standardized language, ultimately became a footnote in his own mortality saga. Not because of what he built, but because of how he died. There is something deeply human about it. The refusal to accept limits, the desire to outwit nature, the desperate need to control the uncontrollable. It's easy to mock and tempting to admire, but mostly it's familiar, because we are still doing it. Different ingredients, different marketing, same basic fear. Qin Shi Huang's death is not just the tale of an ancient tyrant undone by bad science. It's a cautionary tale about belief, untempered by reason. About the dangers of being surrounded by people too afraid to tell you you're wrong. About what happens when ambition refuses to make peace with biology. He wanted to live forever. He got a clay army, and a mausoleum full of mercury, and a chapter in every history book titled Irony. So the next time someone offers you a miracle cure, a life-extending tincture, or an immortality juice shot, think of the first emperor. Think of the mercury. Think of the fish in the carriage. And remember, death may not be optional, but at least you can try not to drink it. Pope John XII was not, by any stretch of the imagination, hired for his spiritual credentials. He was, quite literally, appointed pope as a teenager, because his father thought it would be politically convenient. That should already be a red flag. In fact, it's the ecclesiastical equivalent of handing a Ferrari to a hormonal 16-year-old and hoping for the best. Unsurprisingly, it did not end well. Born Octavianus around the year 937, he was the son of Alberic II, the powerful ruler of Rome, who believed that placing his son on the papal throne would help consolidate the family's grip on power. So, when Alberic died, Octavianus, who had approximately zero training in theology, canon law, or basic restraint, was elevated to the papacy at around age 18. He took the name John XII and promptly began treating the Vatican less like a religious institution and more like a debauched frat house with better architecture. The papal palace became infamous. Reports describe it as a revolving door of mistresses, gambling, drunken feasts, and behavior that would have gotten a minor baron excommunicated, let alone the actual pope. He was accused of turning the Lateran Palace into a literal brothel. He allegedly toasted the devil, ordained a deacon in a stable while drunk, and prayed to pagan gods during dice games. According to one source, he even gave away church lands in exchange for favors from his lovers. Others claim he murdered a man while attempting to bless him. Subtlety was not his strong suit. These accusations come largely from his enemies, of course, many of whom had a vested interest in dethroning him, but the sheer volume and consistency of the accounts suggest that, at the very least, John XII was not exactly pious. Even in an age when most popes were more politician than pastor, he stood out, not for sanctity, but for recklessness. What makes his story particularly bizarre is how long it took anyone to do something about it. Part of that delay stemmed from the weird relationship between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. John needed protection from enemies in Rome, so he made a deal with Otto I, the German king, inviting him to be crowned emperor in exchange for military support. Otto arrived. John crowned him. Everyone smiled. And then John immediately began conspiring with Otto's enemies, because apparently betrayal was just another sacrament in John's version of Catholicism. Otto responded, as emperors tend to do, by marching back to Rome with an army. In 963, he convened a synod of bishops who collectively decided that John XII was no longer fit for office. This was not a theological debate. It was a laundry list of crimes: perjury, murder, adultery, simony, blasphemy. One bishop reportedly said John was a pope in name only. Another pointed out that he had seen John toast to Bacchus in the middle of a mass. The synod deposed him and installed a replacement pope. Problem solved. Except not, because John wasn't the kind of man to go quietly. He fled Rome, gathered support, and when Otto left town, he marched back in and retook the papacy like a drunken king in a bad play. He tortured, mutilated, or exiled everyone who had dared vote against him. It was a violent reassertion of divine authority, if you believe that divinity can be measured in broken bones. And then, in an ending both sudden and entirely in character, John XII died the following year. Officially, the cause was a stroke. Unofficially, legend holds that he died in bed while committing adultery, either from apoplexy or being beaten by the husband of his mistress. Historians differ, but the general consensus is it was undignified, which feels like justice. John XII was not a reformer. He was not a theologian. He was barely a Christian in any recognizable sense. But he left behind a legacy so scandalous that future church councils used him as a cautionary tale. His behavior was one of the catalysts for greater efforts at reform within the papacy, eventually leading to the Gregorian reforms a century later. In other words, he was such a disaster that he became useful. That's a rare skill. The church, of course, quietly scrubbed his memory where it could. There are no stained glass windows of John XII, no chapels named in his honor, just footnotes, whispers, a lesson in what happens when power is given without scrutiny and cloaked in the robes of sanctity. His papacy was short, chaotic, and astonishingly offensive. And yet, it survives in the annals of history, not because of what he built, but because of how thoroughly he demolished the illusion of papal holiness. John XII is not a martyr, he's a mirror, held up to a church that, at times, seemed to forget its own rules. And while the modern papacy bears little resemblance to his reign, the memory of what happens when power runs unchecked still haunts the archives. So the next time someone insists that popes are always holy men chosen by divine wisdom, feel free to mention John XII, the pope who toasted Bacchus, gambled with bishops, and died the way he lived, awkwardly, scandalously, and entirely on brand. King Alexander of Greece ruled for just 3 years. He didn't die in battle. He wasn't assassinated by a political rival. He didn't slip in the bath or succumb to a royal curse. King Alexander died because a monkey bit him. It would be funny if it weren't so staggeringly absurd. The year was 1920. Greece was in the middle of a complicated and violent national drama involving World War I, the Greco-Turkish War, internal political factions, and the fallout of a monarchic reshuffling, so confusing it made your average soap opera look like a spreadsheet. Amid all this, Alexander, second son of King Constantine, I, was shoved onto the throne in 1917 after his father and older brother were forced to step aside by Allied powers who didn't like their pro-German sympathies. Alexander, then 23, was chosen because he was young, untested, and considered politically harmless, which is exactly the kind of person you want running a country during a major geopolitical crisis. He spent most of his short reign as a puppet king, with actual decisions being made by Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos and his administration. Alexander, meanwhile, lived in the royal palace in Athens with his dog, his fiancée-turned-wife Aspasia, and apparently an unhealthy proximity to wild animals. And this brings us to the monkey, or, to be more precise, the two monkeys. On the 2nd of October, 1000, 920, the king took a walk in the palace gardens with his dog. The details from here are so ridiculous that they've been repeated with a tone of disbelief for over a century. The dog got into a scuffle with a pet Barbary macaque, owned by the palace staff, because of course the palace staff had monkeys, and the king intervened. As he tried to separate the animals, a second monkey appeared and bit him, hard, on the leg and torso. The monkeys fled. The king was patched up, and that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The wounds became infected. And thanks to a combination of pride, bad medical advice, and an imperial tradition of pretending things weren't serious until they very much were, the infection worsened. Within days, the king developed a high fever. Gangrene set in. By the time doctors tried to intervene properly, it was too late. On the 25th of October, just 3 weeks after the monkey attack, King Alexander of Greece died of sepsis at the age of 27. The news shocked the nation. Not because he had died young, this was not uncommon for royals in high-stress eras, but because of how he died. It wasn't a heroic battlefield demise. It wasn't a noble sacrifice. It wasn't even a tragically romantic illness. It was monkeys, in the palace garden, over a dogfight. The political fallout was immediate and chaotic. Because Alexander had died without an heir, and because his father and brother were both in exile, Greece was plunged into a constitutional crisis. The monarchy, once barely clinging to public legitimacy, now looked like a farce. The country soon held a referendum to bring King Constantine I back, undoing years of political maneuvering and setting the stage for even more instability. In short, the monkey did more to shape modern Greek history than some entire governments. This is not hyperbole. Historians genuinely refer to Alexander's death as a turning point. Winston Churchill himself later remarked, with classic understatement, that a monkey bite caused the death of a king and the loss of Eastern Thrace. That's a real quote, and not even the strangest part of the story. Because what makes this tale so chilling isn't just the absurdity, it's the reminder of how fragile power is. Here was a king, a monarch surrounded by guards, servants, doctors, and diplomats, a man theoretically protected by centuries of tradition and authority, and all it took to end his life was an irritated primate with good aim. It's the historical equivalent of slipping on a banana peel and causing a revolution. King Alexander is now mostly a footnote in the broader saga of 20th century Greece. He didn't reform the state. He didn't win great wars. He didn't build monuments or pass sweeping laws. His main legacy is as a cautionary tale about underestimating minor things. Infections, wild animals, the butterfly effect of a bite. There is no grand statue commemorating the monkey, no national holiday, but there probably should be. Because in the end, it did what no general or politician could. It stopped a monarchy in its tracks. So the next time someone speaks of royal destiny or the divine right of kings, you might want to ask, yes, but have they considered the monkeys? History, as always, has a sense of humor. It just tends to kill you with it. Charles the Bad of Navarre did not earn his nickname by accident. He was, by most historical accounts, deeply unlikable. A schemer, a backstabber, a chronic oath-breaker, and the kind of man who would probably poison your tea and then complain that it tasted funny. Born in 1332 into a life of wealth and political advantage, Charles spent most of his career making enemies. His own people distrusted him. The French and English loathed him. Even chroniclers of the time, who normally bent over backward to justify the actions of nobility, struggled to find anything redeeming. He was the medieval equivalent of a badly written villain, greedy, paranoid, and endlessly self-sabotaging. So when he died in one of the most humiliating and painful ways imaginable, the general response was not sympathy but something closer to schadenfreude. It was 1387, and Charles, by then old, sick, and extremely unpopular, had taken to his bed. He was suffering from a chronic illness, likely related to years of stress, poisonings, both real and imagined, and possibly the guilt of betraying everyone he had ever worked with. He was bedridden, weak, and in constant pain. So his doctors, as was the custom in 14th century medicine, did something completely unhelpful. They ordered him wrapped from neck to toe in linen cloths soaked in brandy. This was supposedly to warm the body and improve circulation, which in the logic of medieval healthcare was only slightly more advanced than bloodletting by moonlight. And then came the fatal moment. According to contemporary sources, a careless servant entered the room and instead of cutting the linen, decided to use a candle to burn off the excess fabric. Because if there's one thing you want near a flammable human burrito soaked in alcohol, it's an open flame. The linen caught fire immediately. So did Charles. What followed was not quick. He burned alive on his own sickbed, screaming, flailing, and almost certainly reflecting on a life spent alienating every single person who might have been willing to help him. The details of the scene were so horrific that even hostile chroniclers took a moment to grimace before returning to their usual rhythm of "he deserved it." The entire event played out like a parable. A man drenched in his own toxicity, ignited by the very people tasked with protecting him, left to burn in a room filled with regret and smoke. If medieval Europe had health and safety regulations, this would have violated all of them. The symbolism, of course, is irresistible. Charles the Bad, known for his treachery and combustible temper, ends his life as a literal human torch. It feels like something out of a stage play, written by a very angry monk. But it's not fiction. Multiple sources, including chroniclers from both French and Navarrese camps, confirm the story with grim consistency. What's even more absurd is how avoidable it was. The servant could have used scissors, or called for help, or simply not brought fire into a room filled with alcohol-soaked cloth. But this was a royal court that had long since stopped functioning on logic. Charles had alienated his allies, threatened his neighbors, and turned his palace into a paranoid fortress of mistrust. By the end, he was surrounded not by loyal aides but by people who likely hated him just enough to follow instructions exactly. The aftermath was strangely quiet. His death didn't provoke mourning or revolution. There were no grand funerals, no processions of weeping courtiers. His son, Charles III, inherited the throne, and in a surprising turn, earned the nickname Charles the Noble. Historians suspect this was a deliberate rebranding effort, like changing your family name after a very public scandal involving fire and terrible decisions. Today, Charles the Bad lives on mostly in footnotes and cautionary tales. He's remembered not for his policies or military campaigns, but for his grotesque and poetic death. The kind of death that makes you wonder if history isn't written by the victors, but by people with a very dark sense of humor. His life was a study in bad diplomacy. His death was a masterclass in medieval risk management failure. And together, they form one of the most oddly satisfying narrative arcs in royal history. So the next time someone romanticizes the glory of monarchy, the elegance of royal courts, or the wisdom of noble bloodlines, you might want to bring up Charles the Bad, a king who spent his life setting fires, and then, in the end, became one. History, as always, does not forgive. It simply writes your obituary with irony and a quill soaked in brandy. Edmund Ironside, King of England, for all of 7 months in the year 1016, had one of those careers that promised legend and delivered footnote. He was the son of Ethelred the Unready, who, true to nickname, left his son a collapsing kingdom, a Viking invasion, and a royal court held together by passive-aggressive letters and stale bread. But unlike his father, Edmund had backbone and swords, and an annoying refusal to die in battle, which made his actual death all the more ridiculous. Because, according to at least one version of the story, and medieval chroniclers are nothing, if not imaginative, Edmund Ironside may have been assassinated while using the toilet. And not just any toilet, a royal privy, a throne beneath the throne. It's a detail so absurd that it loops around to tragic, then back to hilarious, then lands somewhere in the uncanny valley of historical embarrassment. But first, the context. In 1016, England was a blood-stained chessboard. The Danes, led by Canute, Yes, that Canute were invading, and the Anglo-Saxon nobility were more interested in infighting than in actual fighting. Edmund stood almost alone in opposing the invasion. He earned the nickname Ironside because of his physical toughness and relentless campaigning, though one suspects his PR team had limited options and went with whatever sounded least like the desperate. He fought 5 major battles against Canute that year, lost most of them, and still somehow didn't collapse. Eventually, a peace treaty was arranged. England would be divided. Edmund would rule Wessex, and Canute would take the north. It was a compromise nobody liked, but everyone could survive, for about 5 weeks. And then, suddenly, Edmund was dead. The official cause was never confirmed. Some sources say natural causes, as if 26-year-old warlords often keel over from sheer exhaustion. Others suggest more nefarious means. Which brings us to the Privy. One medieval chronicle, not necessarily the most reliable, but definitely the most creative, claims that Edmund was murdered by an assassin who had concealed himself inside the royal toilet. The plan, if one can call it that, was simple. Hide in the pit, wait for the king, stab him from below, escape, somehow. This would require impressive planning, a high tolerance for sewage, and a spiritual commitment to job completion rarely seen outside of spy thrillers or deeply unsettling plumbing horror. The assassin allegedly used a dagger, inserted through the, shall we say, least defended point of entry. Edmund collapsed, mortally wounded, and died shortly thereafter. The chronicler, perhaps unsure whether to be shocked or impressed, records this without so much as a metaphor. It is, by any measure, the most ignoble possible death for a man called Ironside. The historical consensus is divided. Some historians believe the Privy story is pure fiction, a slanderous myth invented to discredit a warrior king and entertain future generations of monks with crude humor. Others argue that the lack of clarity surrounding Edmund's death lends credibility to the theory. After all, medieval politics was less about fairness and more about who could remove whose internal organs with the least paperwork. The main suspect, if one must assign guilt, would be someone in Canute's circle, perhaps a mercenary, or a disaffected noble, or just someone very small and very comfortable in confined, disgusting spaces. Whether the tale is true or not almost doesn't matter, because history, especially medieval history, thrives on stories that resonate. And nothing resonates quite like a king, felled not on the battlefield, but on the loo. It reduces monarchy to its most vulnerable state. It reminds us that for all their titles, crowns, and mythologized greatness, kings were still human, still made of flesh, still required to relieve themselves, and occasionally, still subject to the most humiliating ends imaginable. Edmund Ironside deserved better. He fought valiantly. He stood against overwhelming odds. He tried to hold a kingdom together, using the medieval equivalent of duct tape and misplaced optimism, but in the end, he died off-screen, quietly, suspiciously, possibly while trying to have 5 minutes of privacy. His body was buried in Glastonbury Abbey, far from the scene of his final defeat. His reign was forgotten by most. Canute would go on to rule all of England, retroactively absorbing Edmund's brief tenure into a larger narrative of conquest and consolidation. But for those who dig into the margins of history, Edmund's death lingers, not just for its comedic horror, but for what it reveals about the precariousness of power. One moment, you're king. The next, you're a cautionary tale in a monastery scriptorium, with monks snickering behind their ink pots. So the next time someone speaks of royal glory, or the divine right of kings, or the majestic legacy of monarchy, remember Edmund Ironside, and maybe think twice about where you sit. History has many thrones. Only some of them are made of gold. King Henry I of England had a problem. Not with wars or rebellions or chronic insomnia from managing a medieval bureaucracy held together by bribes and bad handwriting, though all of those surely applied, but with his stomach. Specifically, his absolute refusal to stop eating lampreys. Lampreys, for the uninitiated, are not fish. They are ancient, jawless, parasitic creatures that resemble eels, if eels were designed by someone trying to give you nightmares. They suck blood, latch onto other fish, and have faces that look like someone tried to make a leech aerodynamic. But in medieval cuisine, especially among the elite, lampreys were delicacies, high-status sea tubes of gelatinous prestige. Nobles adored them, kings obsessed over them, and no one loved lampreys quite as much as Henry I. Born in 1068, Henry was the fourth son of William the Conqueror. Nobody expected him to rule anything, much less become King of England and Duke of Normandy. But thanks to some convenient sibling deaths, ruthless ambition, and a few well-timed backstabbings, some metaphorical, others less so, Henry clawed his way to power. He was intelligent, ruthless, and reasonably competent by medieval standards, which meant he only killed the people he absolutely had to. His reign was marked by legal reform, administrative growth, and a talent for turning political chaos into slightly more organized chaos. But for all his strategic brilliance, Henry's real weakness came not on the battlefield but at the dinner table. In 1135, Henry was in Normandy, likely inspecting castles, reprimanding barons, and congratulating himself for outliving most of his enemies. And then, like so many tragedies in history, it happened over dinner, despite warnings from his doctors, who had repeatedly told him that lampreys didn't agree with his aging digestive system. Henry sat down to an excessive feast of his favorite treat, a lamprey binge, possibly boiled, possibly roasted, almost certainly unwise. The result was immediate and catastrophic. He fell violently ill, whether it was food poisoning, an allergic reaction, or a pre-existing condition aggravated by indulgence. We'll never know. What we do know is that within days, Henry was dead. The official chroniclers, with typical medieval flair, noted that he died from a surfeit of lampreys, a phrase that has become a kind of culinary epitaph. There are few rulers in history who can claim to have been defeated by dinner. Henry I, unfortunately, is one of them. His death triggered one of the worst succession crises in English history. He had named his daughter Matilda as his heir, but the nobility, being allergic to female leadership and addicted to civil war, promptly ignored this. Instead, they backed Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, and kicked off a decades-long conflict known as the Anarchy. It was a period of confusion, violence, shifting alliances, and enough betrayals to fuel 10 Shakespeare plays, all because one king couldn't say no to a slimy prehistoric fish. His body was embalmed, shipped back to England, and buried at Reading Abbey, which he had founded. According to legend, the embalming process did not go well. Some accounts claim that the corpse began to rot before it reached its final resting place. One version even says that the body exploded during the funeral rites, a final indignity that, true or not, feels narratively appropriate, because in many ways, Henry's story is a case study in royal irony. He survived political purges, civil uprisings, invasions, and power struggles. He ruled a fractious kingdom for 35 years, introduced laws, strengthened the treasury, and outmaneuvered his enemies. And then he lost to lampreys. His reign reminds us that no amount of strategic genius can protect you from your own appetites, that the greatest empires can be undone, not by armies or assassins, but by the refusal to skip a second helping. Henry I did not die in battle. He was not felled by treason or plague. He died doing what he loved, eating something that looked like it crawled out of a river to demand revenge. Today, lampreys are mostly remembered for this one anecdote. They've become a historical punchline, the culinary ghost of a king who couldn't resist them. But in medieval Europe, they were more than food. They were status symbols, badges of refined, if misguided, taste. And Henry was their most loyal customer. So the next time someone tells you history is filled with noble sacrifice and heroic deeds, you might want to mention Henry I, the king who unified a kingdom, stabilized a crown, and died from a mouthful of sea leeches. History doesn't always end with a sword in the gut. Sometimes it ends with indigestion. James II of Scotland had a thing for cannons. Not the symbolic, parade-ready, ceremonial types you see in movies where they're polished and mostly decorative. No, James preferred the real ones. The loud, heavy, unpredictable, very much still being invented kind that could either win you a battle or scatter your limbs across a field like badly planned confetti. Born in 1430, into a Scotland that could generously be described as chaotically medieval, James inherited the throne at age 6 after his father was assassinated, which was more or less the default retirement plan for Scottish kings. His early years were managed by regents, noble power struggles, and the usual stew of betrayal, grudges, and paranoia. By the time James took full control in his late teens, he had developed a taste for direct action. And by direct, we mean explosive. James wasn't just interested in warfare. He was fascinated by artillery, the bleeding edge of 15th century military innovation, where iron met ambition and very few people knew what they were doing. Cannons were the future. They were also, unfortunately, made with the same scientific rigor as a child assembling fireworks from kitchen supplies. But James was not discouraged. He became obsessed. He invested in cannons, transported them across muddy terrain, dragged them through sieges. He watched them closely during battles, eager to see these roaring beasts chew through castle walls and rewrite the rules of warfare. It was bold. It was modern. It was, as it turns out, also very stupid. In 1460, James II laid siege to Roxburgh Castle, one of the last strongholds still held by the English on Scottish soil. The campaign was going well. Morale was high. The cannons were booming, until one of them wasn't. Accounts vary slightly, but the consensus is that James was standing next to one of his favourite cannons, possibly nicknamed the Lion or something equally dramatic, when it exploded. Not a little explosion, a full shrapnel-ripping, skull-shattering detonation that tore apart the king and whatever poor soul was standing beside him. In an instant, the royal body was turned into a historical anecdote. The iron barrel of the cannon had likely been flawed. Too much powder, not enough reinforcement, a miscalculation of pressure, a failure of metallurgy, or just sheer bad luck. Whatever the cause, it vaporized the man who had bet his military future on iron and fire. The King of Scotland died, not in glorious battle, not in treacherous murder, but in what modern historians might generously classify as a preventable workplace accident. There were no last words, no dramatic goodbyes, just a loud noise, a mess of limbs, and a very confused field camp. Strangely, the Scottish army didn't panic. They just kept going. Within hours of James's explosive exit, the castle was taken, and the army rallied around his son, who was promptly declared James III. It turns out the death of a monarch, even one reduced to fragments, didn't slow things down much in 15th century Scotland. There is a special kind of irony in the way James died. A king who admired the terrifying power of new technology, taken out by its fundamental instability. It's a death that says less about heroism and more about what happens when enthusiasm outpaces common sense. James II's legacy is often overshadowed by this final, smoky act. But before that, he had been an effective ruler in a difficult time. He reduced the power of overmighty nobles, strengthened the central authority of the crown, and tried, occasionally with success, to drag Scotland into the modern world. But history is cruelly selective. It remembers his reforms only vaguely. It remembers his ambition faintly. It remembers, with crystal clarity, that one time he stood next to a cannon and became royal shrapnel. Today, his death is mostly referenced in footnotes, battlefield tours, and the occasional list of weird ways kings have died, which, frankly, is exactly where it belongs. Because if you're going to be remembered for anything in history, it may as well be for literally going out with a bang. So the next time someone tells you about the romance of monarchy, the nobility of kingship, or the grand strategies of medieval warfare, feel free to mention James II of Scotland, a man who believed in progress, a man who loved firepower, and a man who serves as a permanent reminder that standing next to early artillery is not an act of courage, it's just bad decision-making. History doesn't spare you because you're king, especially when you're standing next to a pipe bomb in a kilt. Elagabalus, Emperor of Rome, from 218 to 222 CE, was not so much a ruler as he was a fever dream with a crown, born Varius Avitus Bassianus. He was only 14 when he was hoisted onto the imperial throne by a combination of military revolt, maternal ambition, and the collective exhaustion of a Roman Empire that had already burned through a concerning number of emperors in a very short span of time. The plan was simple. The Severan dynasty needed a male figurehead, and this boy, draped in Eastern mysticism and priestly robes, fit the silhouette. What followed was a reign that would make even the most decadent soap opera feel underproduced. Elagabalus didn't just rule Rome. He bewildered it, offended it, drenched it in perfume, gold dust, and ritual sacrifice. He didn't just cross the line of Roman decorum. He ripped it up, danced on it in heels, and then fed it to his pet lions. The boy emperor, raised in the sun-worshipping cult of the Syrian deity Elagabal, brought his god with him to Rome. Literally, he built a massive temple, declared Elagabal the chief god of the Roman pantheon, and married his deity to a Vestal virgin in what can only be described as the world's most blasphemous wedding. To the Roman Senate, steeped in traditions of Jupiter and Mars, this was not just strange. It was a theological middle finger, but religion was just the beginning. Elagabalus treated the empire like his personal runway. He wore silk gowns, heavy makeup, and extravagant wigs, and paraded through the city in chariots pulled by naked women. He appointed his lovers to high office, fired officials for being boring, and reportedly asked physicians to give him a sex change, centuries before that concept had even reached the Western lexicon. He was, to put it mildly, ahead of his time in ways Rome had absolutely no patience for. The historian Cassius Dio, whose tolerance for imperial insanity had been tested many times, described Elagabalus's reign as the greatest disgrace of all. Modern scholars tend to see him as a victim of cultural misunderstanding, a queer teenager forced into the world's most dangerous job, and then judged by centuries of historians who couldn't even spell nuance. Still, even the most generous interpretations have to wrestle with the avalanche of chaos that characterized his administration. Banquets with food glued to the ceiling, deadly practical jokes involving wild animals, random executions, mass firings, public orgies, a declared intent to make Rome a theocracy centered on a foreign sun god, and, just to keep things light, the occasional order that guests be buried alive if they fell asleep during his poetry readings. Unsurprisingly, this did not sit well with the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, or literally anyone trying to maintain a functioning empire. After 4 years of relentless weirdness, the boy emperor's own grandmother, Julia Maesa, the political mastermind who had helped place him on the throne, decided enough was enough. In 222 CE, Elagabalus and his mother were invited to a meeting with the Praetorian Guard, which turned out to be less of a meeting and more of a murder. The guards dragged the teenager through the streets, beheaded him, mutilated his body, and dumped the remains into the Tiber River. His name was stricken from official records, his statues were torn down, and Rome tried briefly and unsuccessfully to pretend the whole thing had never happened. But history, inconveniently, remembers. Elagabalus remains one of the most vilified emperors in Roman history. He is also one of the most fascinating, because beneath the scandal lies something deeper, a lesson about power, perception, and the violent limits of empire. Rome could tolerate madmen, tyrants, even megalomaniacs, but it could not tolerate flamboyant nonconformity that questioned every norm it held sacred. Elagabalus didn't just challenge Rome's sense of masculinity or religion. He undermined its belief that emperors should at least pretend to be normal. His reign is less a political failure and more a cultural panic attack in purple silk. In a time when emperors were expected to act like gods while pretending to be men, Elagabalus acted like neither. He was something else entirely. And Rome, built on legions and tradition, responded with brutal efficiency. Today, scholars debate how much of the surviving scandal is true and how much was invented by hostile historians eager to erase a figure who didn't fit. But the details, however embellished, still shimmer with something real. A teenager thrown into the meat grinder of history, flailing with gold and incense until it swallowed him whole. So the next time someone tells you that history favors the bold, remind them of Elagabalus. Sometimes, bold gets you a temple, a scandal, and a head-first dive into a river, and a footnote that smells faintly of roses and disaster. Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia from 1762 to 1796, is remembered for many things: her sweeping reforms, expansion of the empire, correspondence with Enlightenment philosophers, and somehow, despite all that, an entirely fabricated and remarkably persistent rumor involving a horse. That's the thing about history. You can rule one of the largest empires in the world for over 3 decades, modernize its administration, revolutionize its education system, sponsor the arts, and still be reduced to one grotesque piece of gossip that has the intellectual integrity of a middle school dare. The rumor, for anyone blissfully unaware, is that Catherine died while attempting to have relations with a stallion. Yes, a horse. According to absolutely no credible sources, her death was the result of a mechanical harness gone wrong, a dose of ambition, and a deeply confused animal. The story is, to be clear, false. Not just slightly inaccurate. Completely, utterly, categorically false. Catherine the Great died of a stroke in bed at the age of 67. The horse never existed. The apparatus never existed. The entire narrative is the historical equivalent of a bathroom wall scroll. Yet it's one of the most well-known facts about one of history's most effective rulers. So where did it come from? Misogyny, mostly, and political slander. Catherine came to power in 1762 after a coup that removed her husband, Peter III, a man so unpopular that even his own guards were reportedly confused he'd lasted that long. Once in power, Catherine launched a campaign of modernization that put her in direct contrast to the image of traditional womanhood expected by European elites. She was ambitious, intelligent, and unapologetically in control. And that, for her male contemporaries and generations of male historians, was deeply threatening. So, they invented stories. They exaggerated her love life, turned her relationships into orgies, and painted her as a nymphomaniac rather than an intellectual. The horse rumor likely didn't appear until decades after her death, spread by pamphlets, enemies of the Russian court, and bored aristocrats with too much ink and not enough imagination. It's telling that this was the lie that stuck. Not a political scandal, not a financial conspiracy. A sexual smear so cartoonishly absurd that it reveals far more about the people who repeated it than the woman it targeted. Because Catherine, inconveniently, was everything the rumor tried to erase. She was born in Prussia as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, married into the Russian royal family at 16, and outmaneuvered everyone from palace guards to European monarchs. She wrote essays on governance, translated French philosophers into Russian, and corresponded with Voltaire as casually as most people send shopping lists. She expanded Russian territory by hundreds of thousands of square miles, absorbed Crimea, restructured the legal system, and funded schools and hospitals with the kind of zeal modern governments can only fake during election years. She survived rebellions, court intrigue, assassination plots, and the general hostility of a world allergic to powerful women. And still, all some people remember is the horse. Her real death in 1796 was not scandalous. She collapsed in her private quarters and died hours later. Her body was laid out in full imperial regalia, surrounded by courtiers in a kingdom that, while often tense and divided, recognized the enormity of her legacy. But for reasons best explained by a toxic cocktail of sexism and idle rumor-mongering, that legacy was allowed to rot in the shadow of a myth. Today, historians spend as much time debunking the horse nonsense as they do analyzing her policies, which says something profound and depressing about how we remember women in power. Catherine is not the only one to be posthumously slandered. Of course, Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." Cleopatra was not simply a seductress, and Elizabeth I, despite the rumors, did not die a virgin because her body was riddled with secret deformities. But Catherine's case is unique in the sheer absurdity of the claim and its tenacity. Generations have whispered it, laughed at it, passed it on as trivia, and used it as a punchline, often without knowing who Catherine was or what she did. It's history reduced to a meme, and that should concern anyone who believes that legacies are shaped by actions, because clearly, sometimes they're shaped by lies. So what do we do with all this? We tell the truth. We remind people that Catherine the Great was a political juggernaut, a reformer, and a monarch who outshone nearly all her male contemporaries. We can laugh at the absurdity of the rumor, yes, but we should also understand why it exists. It's not just an old joke. It's a cultural defense mechanism against female authority, a grotesque little myth designed to make power look ridiculous when it wears a dress. So the next time you hear the horse story, correct it. Not just for Catherine, but for every powerful woman history tried to reduce to scandal. Because Catherine the Great was many things, but what she wasn't, ever, was that rumor. And if you still need a punchline, remember this. The empire she built is still remembered. The man who started the lie? We don't even know his name.